Hey folks, and welcome back. So in this video, I'm basically going to share some information from a email and a conversation I had with one of my followers. And this came from actually my Facebook, not my YouTube. But I post everything on my YouTube, of course. So I have done 2 or 3 videos on landing RC aircraft. And if you're new to my channel, I only share my own experiences in my videos. I don't try to speculate. I don't try to say what other people have done. Rarely will I do that. Maybe I do. But I try to just talk about what has worked for me so that I know if you try it, it should work for you if you do exactly what I did. So in this video, we are going to look at some things that kind of came to mind when me and this young kid was talking about flying and landing model airplanes. And when I say young kid, he's like 22. I'm 60-ish, or almost 60. And he said he had watched my videos, but he was still having a hard time really acing landings. And when I started talking to him, he was talking about different airframes he had been flying. So his trainer, he could ace every time. But some of his other airplanes, he would either bounce. One, he actually crashed, which he admittedly stalled the airplane. And then we started talking about, you know, how he learned to fly and where he practiced, what kind of instruction he got. We talked about, I explained to him that the different configurations of planes will make a big difference in the way that one lands versus another. And then I talked about the design. Planes can be designed that are inherently hard to land. And then I talked about the passion that we have, which creates a fear sometimes that, you know, we take off and we're excited, and then we've got to land the airplane and we're afraid of hurting it because we have such deep passions for, you know, either the time it took to build that airplane, or we saved up a year worth of money to buy that airframe, and we love our airplanes. We don't want to crash them. So if you are new to my channel, I'm obsessed with giant scale aircraft, okay? And that's my passion, is designing or coming up with a concept of why I'm going to build an airplane, then designing it in CAD, moving it into 3D to make sure all the parts fit, and then test flying it and enjoying it. So my passion is giant scale airplanes. It's actually full scale. I just can't afford full scale like I would if I was a millionaire. So, but my passion is giant scale aircraft. I do have some ARFs. I'm going to talk about airframes in a minute. Before we get too far into this, I want to throw a shout out to my one of my sponsors. It's RTL Fasteners. If you need bolts, nuts, blind nuts, socket head, lock washers, servo screws, anything that you need for the hobby, these people will have it. If you go to their website and you buy more than $50 a product and you use the code DA30, you'll get 30% off that order. It's a really kick-ass deal. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about airframes, because when I fly at a fly-in or go to a club to fly, I love to listen. Sometimes the smartest people at the field are the people who are talking the least. Okay? And when I hear a big mouth just talking about all of the things they do with aviation, or if they're an instructor and this is how they teach. I've taught about 101 people, I think it is, or 102 people how to fly model airplanes in my life. And I overheard a guy one time who said he was a CFI for full scale, and this is how he taught people. And it makes me go back and remember one time when I was going on a biennial flight review with a CFI, and I did a really aggravated power on stall on a Cherokee. And I used rudder to keep the ball centered and basically to hold my heading in the stall. And he screamed at me, "You don't touch the rudder in a stall, you can spin the airplane." And I thought, what a crock of crap. Because this CFI didn't know how planes stall. And it scared the crap out of me. And I said to him, "Have you ever spun a plane?" "Well, no, you don't spin planes." "Well, no, you don't spin a Cherokee because it's not rated for a spin. But haven't you gone up in like a Citabria, or haven't you gone up in a Cessna 150, or haven't you gone up in something and spun a plane?" "Oh, no." And I never flew with them again. I didn't even get my biennial. I landed. I quit my biennial flight review flight and found another instructor at a different airport. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is you can have a crappy instructor teach you how to be a crappy RC pilot. Okay? And that's the reason I think flight instruction is so important. And it's hard with all the egos in model aviation. A lot of old timers, if they know you like quads, or they know you like FPV, they might not even talk to you. And that's just, it's obscenely sad. But if you find the right instructor, you're probably going to become a great pilot. But nowadays we have another thing that helps us a lot, and that's the simulators, like real flight. If you spend a winter or 3 or 4 months on a simulator and fly all the different airplanes, and you can go in the simulators and actually add a lot of weight to the airplane that it's almost unflyable. Or you can move the CG back where it's almost unflyable. Unflyable or virtually unflyable planes teach you a lot of technique and skills. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about skills in this video and discipline. Because when you learn to fly and get your instruction and you start flying different airframes, which I'm going to talk about now, you'll start realizing that no two airplanes hardly ever fly the same. So this is my Rockstar biplane. I actually won this in a raffle up in Minnesota at a fly-in. And I think it's Watts over Owatonna is where I won this. And this is a kick-ass little airplane. I kind of call this my beater plane. If I crashed it, I'm not going to be completely heartbroken, but I would be very sad because it is a great flying little airplane. Now look, it's not unlimited 3D. It's just a good all-around flying airplane. But this airplane has some interesting characteristics. A, it's a tail dragger. B, it's a little bit draggy because it's a biplane. And it doesn't have anything you have to worry about in flying it. And that's what I'll talk about in a little bit is configuration. It doesn't have flaps to put down. It doesn't have wheels to put down. So this airplane is in the same configuration when it flies around. But when I fly my Avante here, this is kind of a test bed for me because this is an Avante EDF that I fiberglassed and painted to see how much weight it would add, doing the lightest glassing I could do to it. And then I 3D printed some custom stall fences and put on the wings, removed the stock ones and put those on. And I wanted to see how this plane behaved because I always love to experiment. If you followed me for any time at all, you know I love to experiment. I love to build giant scale, but I also love to take ARFs and turn them into Frankenstein planes. And so this airplane versus the biplane fly completely different. They land completely different. Okay, we're talking about landing today. This airplane is one of my favorites now. It's a Cessna 170 by Flex Innovations. To me, this is one of the best flying airplanes I've ever owned that's an ARF. Without a doubt, one of the best. I love this airplane. And I was lucky. Some friends helped me get this airplane. You do not have unlimited funds. And it was kind of a gift to me. But this airplane is one of my favorites now. It lands completely different than my biplane, completely different than my Avante. Actually, this plane, I don't like flaps on airplanes, on model airplanes, because you really don't need them. But on this airplane with flaps, you can get this plane so slow and it's so easy to trim and fly. And I'm going to talk about trim in a minute and how important that is with landing too. This is my MSL-1, 197-inch, 6,000 watt, 71 pound airplane I designed and built. This lands unlike any airplane I have, not even close. If you are not a rudder pilot, you won't like flying this. This has huge barn door ailerons, which cause just huge adverse yaw. So if you are not a rudder pilot, you probably wouldn't enjoy this because it would look really wonky in the air, and you may get yourself into that gray corner I talk about and crash it. But this airplane, I actually have to hold about a third throttle when I'm landing it because it has so much drag with that rigging. That rigging is real rigging. That's what holds the wings on and makes them fly the airplane. There's no spar going through the fuselage. But these big baby stroller tires on it, the open rear fuselage, this is a draggy plane. And if you think you're going to turn final and pull it back and just glide it in, you're not. And I'm going to explain in a minute why that's kind of a bad thing for another plane that I flew. So I have 1,352 flights on this. I flew this plane for 6 years. It's in my attic now because I'm going to put floats on it. I just can't afford another motor right now. When you're scratch building or building Frankenstein planes, this was one of my very first scratch builds. And it flew horribly. It landed horribly. Every time I flew it, it tried to kill itself. And I found out later on it was totally my fault. That little canard in the front, anytime the nose would pitch up or down a little bit, it'd grab the wind. And I had really bad pitch stability, not to mention it was grossly underpowered. So I put a third engine on the vertical stab and called it a Trilander, got rid of the canard, and the plane flew really good, got a couple of hundred flights on it. And then I crashed this plane being stupid back in the day. I was flying knife edge down the runway, and one of the engines died, and there was no recovering that. But this airplane was almost impossible to land because the oscillation it'd get into landing. And I thought it was a CG problem. I started putting weight. Keep in mind, sometimes for us to make a plane fly right, we need to stand back before we touch anything and really think about what we're doing before you just start screwing with things. This is an A10 that I scratch built and used two 2-liter bottles for the nacelles. It had .10 engines in it. This plane flew great. It landed great. Being a tricycle made it a little bit easier. This plane was awesome to fly. Okay, and because it was light, it had enough power. Tricycle landing gear. This airplane, I could just ace it. This landed exactly like a low wing trainer. This plane flew exactly like a high wing trainer. This is my C-130, my first scratch built multi-engine airplane. This wing may look familiar if you're a glider pilot. This is a Gentle Lady wing with no dihedral in it. So I had crashed my Gentle Lady back in the day, had the wing, took the monocoat off the wing, made it flat, built me a fuselage. Those are 09 engines, put 4 of those in it. And the reason I had 4.09 engines is, if you are old like me, there used to be a company called MRC, and they made a neat little F-109 styrofoam plane about 2 feet long. And I probably had 6 or 7 of those, and they were so fun to fly. We would dogfight them. I tried to fly between power lines once and cut the stab off and crashed it. So I had totaled at least 4 of these MRC BF-109s or F-109s, and I had 4 engines, and I thought, what the hell? Let's let's build a C-130. And then this is the last plane I want to talk about when I talk about airframes. Now, this was my Byron's original, and I think it was an 84-inch or 86-inch. I can't remember how big it was. Sukhoi aerobatic airplane. Byron Originals did not make really light airplanes. So we just put big old engines on it. And this airplane, believe it or not, I loved it. It kind of flew like a pattern ship, though. It wasn't light. I had about 300 flights on it and sold it to my friend, and he crashed it on the first flight. He had seen me fly it and do so many stunts with it, and I told him, this is a heavy airplane. Get used to it. So he took off, flew knife edge, pulled basically a couple of wonky little maneuvers too low to the ground, and stalled it and augered it in. And, well, he snap rolled it and augered it in. And he felt horrible, but this is a perfect example of me slowly getting used to this airplane and then kind of mastering this airplane and everybody thinking, ooh, ah, that's awesome. And then a really good pilot, my friend was a really good pilot, flying it and crashing it on his first flight. So I know that has nothing to do with landing, but all airframes fly differently. Now what I want to do is talk about configurations. So this airplane, ignore the elevator on it. This was made for a different video. But this airplane is what I call clean, and this airplane's dirty. Okay, so I just want you to understand, clean means your gear's up, flaps up, you are just cruising along. Dirty means your flaps are down, your gear's down. If you had air brakes out, you might have the air brakes out. But what I want to talk about now is the instruction part. And when I would teach people to fly, we always started with, I'm trying to think, I think 99.9% of the time, it was a high wing trainer. Most of the time, it was like an Eagle 2 with a Fox 40 or an OS 46 glow fuel, okay? And this is way before simulators. So what we would do is I would take their airplane, or sometimes even my own airplane, depending on if their airplane was built and ready to fly yet. But if they'd come to me and say, hey, Dad, we want you to teach me how to fly, we want you to teach them how to fly a model airplane, I was always eager to do it. I love instructing people on how to fly airplanes. So, in those 101 or 2 instructions, only one plane crashed. And it was, back in the day, if you had 2 channels on at the same time, it being shot down, it meant that the radio interfered with your radio. And this plane was a little bit glitchy on the ground. And I said to the student, I think we're fine, take off. As soon as he got in the air, the airplane had an epileptic seizure and crashed. And I helped fix the plane for the kid because I felt really bad because I said, yeah, fly it. And somebody had their radio on. And it was just stupidity that I didn't realize it. But what I want to talk about in the instruction is it's so important for you to find somebody that you feel good about, that somebody who praises you and makes you feel good. So here's how I taught people to fly. I would normally take their airplane up and I would do some figure eights. I say, that's a figure 8. I'd do the pattern. I would go down the runway real low, about 5 inches off the ground. And then I'd go up and I'd do a loop and a roll with their airplane. And I say, okay, see, your plane's capable of doing all the cool things you're going to learn how to do. And they're like, okay, I don't know if I can do that. I said, of course you can do that. Or I'd make a joke like, can you see the airplane? Yep, then you can do that. You know, I'd look down. You got arms? Yep. You got thumbs? Yep. You'll learn to do this. So what I would do, and this is even before buddy boxes where we both share the same radio. I would take the radio and hold it right in front of them, take my thumbs off it, and have them, and I would hold the radio from the bottom, and I'd have them put their hands on it, and I'm right beside them. I'd have them really high, and I'd say, okay, now, the plane's starting to fly away. Move the stick to the left. They'd move the stick to the left. And I'd say, don't move the stick up and down. I just want you to move the stick to the left. And the plane would start to do the turn. Of course, it'd start to lose a little altitude. I'd say, okay, now level the wing. They'd level the wing. And if the plane started to get too far away, I'd say, here, let me bring it back. But I always did this at about 3rd throttle. I've seen some instructors, they're up there just flying, you know, at 3/4 or full throttle. And the airplane gets away from the field so quick that way. So I would get the airplane back over us, and I'd teach them basically to fly a circle, and then I'd teach them to go the opposite counterclockwise. And we would probably do a couple of tanks of fuel, leveling out, going into the circle, leveling out, going to the circle. Well, when we'd start leveling out here, we started creating a pattern because the circle had straight lines. And I'd say, do you realize you're pretty much flying the pattern and this is only your 3rd flight? That's awesome. Now, if they were on the 10th flight, I might be thinking, wow, it's going to take a while to get you soloed. But I'd say 95% that I ever taught to fly. And I never had anybody I couldn't teach to fly. Some became really awesome pilots, though, and some were okay. But I would teach them how to fly the pattern. And then we went into figure 8s. And once we had mastered the pattern up high in figure 8s, I'd tell them, okay, now what we're going to do is I want you to pull the power back. Because if you don't know this, everybody, and I've got all my models sitting here. If you, hang on a minute, let me switch screens for a second. This does apply to model aircraft, but you'll notice a lot more in full scale. You use your pitch for airspeed, and you use your power for altitude. Now, if you have a 400 watt per pound 3D airplane, you may not notice it that much. Because if your engine's at a 1/4 throttle and you put the nose up, you're probably going to keep going up. Okay, but in a full-scale aircraft, if you're flying along at cruise and you pull your nose up 5 degrees, your airspeed will go down. Okay, on a model airplane, if you're at a 3rd throttle and you're just staying level and you pull the nose up, yes, the airplane's going to start to climb a little bit, but your airspeed is coming down. So what I want you to think about when you think about instruction is I would teach these people to really use their power for how high they wanted to be. So if we're flying around at a 3rd throttle or maybe 40%, I'd say, okay, bring it all the way down to idle and then bump it up 2 or 3 clicks. And I'd say, and let the plane sink, let the plane come down. Don't hold the nose up. And we would let the plane come down. And when it got, and I'd have them do this basically in crosswind, turning toward base. And then once they entered the base, I would have them pull that throttle back, bump it up 2 or 3 clicks. And I did that for 2 reasons on glow engines. One was I wanted to get the engine at more of a landing RPM, but I also didn't want the engine to die. Glow engines sometimes would load up if you kept them at idle too long. I didn't want the engine to die on a student, because the least you can scare a student and make it exciting for them, the better they're going to be. So we would get down to maybe 40 feet. I'd say, okay, bump the power back up a little bit. I'd say a little bit more right there. Okay, let's fly the pattern. And I'd get them used to flying the pattern at like 30 feet. Then I'd say, okay, we're going to do a couple of low flybys, and I'd get them down to 10 feet. But if they did the first pattern perfect at like 10 feet, the next time they came by us, I'd say, okay, pull it all the way down to idle and just keep the plane level. I want to see how low we can go. Get ready to bring the power back up. And they would come down, come down, come down, and they would touch the grass, roll to a perfect stop, and I'd say, you just did your first landing. I never told them they were going to do their first landing. I didn't want to create that fear of that first landing. I wanted them to show them how easy landing is. As long as the engine will go to idle, you can land the airplane, okay? And they got all excited, like, holy cow, that wasn't that hard. I'd take them up in the air, but I would not let them land the next or the flight or the next flight after that. I didn't want them to start getting tunnel vision on landing. Oh, he's going to make me land again. And I'd be flying it around. I'd say, okay, give me the radio, we're going to land. And they're like, well, you didn't make me land. I'm like, no, I just want you to know how easy it was. We're going to go up and do some other things. Then, believe it or not, I'd teach them to do a loop, and I'd teach them to do a roll. I'd teach them to keep the engine at idle and pull the nose up until it's stalled. And, the airplane would, most RC aircraft just kind of wobbles a little bit and falls over. None of them wanted to spin or anything. And then I would go back to landing. And once they landed maybe 3 times, then we were ready to solo. Now, I wasn't going to make them land on their first solo. I would walk out behind them on the runway, make sure nobody's around, and I'd say, okay, you're going to use that rudder, keep that airplane straight, flight straight away from us, and it will take off on its own, because I had 2 or 3 clicks of up elevator. They would go up to full throttle, or maybe 3/4 throttle. A lot of times I would realize they didn't get to full throttle before the plane was in the air. They were scared to keep pushing the stick. But they would take off, and they're like, well, heck, that was easy. When I instructed people, I wanted everything they did for them to admit that was easy. So that's how I instructed people to fly. But what would happen, and the reason we're talking about landing right now, is they would get really good at that trainer within a month of soloing. And then they want to jump in to an F-104 Starfire and go tear up the sky, okay? So something I want you to think about is I have this pattern picture up here for you. And I want you to think about something in a minute when I go back to talking about configuration for a minute, okay? So when you think about, I don't have any real high wing. Well, yeah. Okay, let's just say for an argument that my Viking here is a high wing trainer. Okay, it won't have retracts, it won't have flaps. When you master this airplane, you're also mastering a proven design that's been designed as a trainer normally. You're mastering a plane that somebody already knows where the CG is, already knows the light wing loading. It's inherently an easy plane to fly. Okay, and you get really good at that. Now, back in the day, I would move into a low wing trainer, called a Sky Tiger. And then once I mastered the Sky Tiger, I started moving into what was called SIG projects, like the Cougar and the Cobra, which were still very light wing loaded planes, but they would go faster. But guess what? Unless you put them on, they didn't have flaps. And unless you put it in, they didn't have retracts. So you were still flying conventional airframes, not ones that you could change the configuration in. Okay? But I would say 1 in 10 students would come back and say, I want to fly something really hot now. They don't even have 75 flights yet. I had a student say one time, how many flights will it take for me to get as good as you, Dag? And I said, look, I'm not that great of a pilot. I mean, I'm a good scale pilot. But when it comes to 3D and aerobatics and pattern stuff, that's not where my passion is. But when you're learning to fly an airplane, if you discipline yourself, you will get skills that will be with you forever. And what I mean by discipline is don't just learn to fly a trainer, and once you've gotten good at it, go out and jump into another airframe. Because I could give you some tests with that trainer that you would fail. I'm almost positive. And an example would be, let's say you've mastered that trainer and you're like, I'm ready for a ARF P40 or an ARF Corsair F4U. I love those. And most of those ARFs are built light enough that they probably could be your second airplane. They probably could. But here's a test I want you to do. If you've mastered your trainer and you think you are you are Chuck Yeager, okay? Take a paper plate, throw it on the runway, and see how many times you can land within 10 feet of that paper plate. A long time ago, when I was younger and dumber, I used to skydive, and you could get what was called a pro rating. And a pro rating, and it might have changed in the last 30 years, but a pro rating means that when you jumped out of the airplane, you could jump into like stadiums, or you could jump into where people are if you had a pro rating. But to get a pro rating, I think you needed 10 landings where you hit the target 10 times when you called. So if you're going to jump out of the airplane and said, I'm calling this as a pro jump, I'm going to land on the target, you had to hit the target. If you had your 9th jump and you missed it, you had to start all over. So I joke with some of my closer friends, like, we should have a pro rating in RC airplanes, which means you could land within 10 feet of that paper plate 10 times in a row. And if you can do that with a trainer, then you can move on to basically any airframe you want, because you have disciplined yourself enough that you can put that airplane exactly where you want it. But when we think about the pattern, I'm going to throw a curveball at where this discipline and this skills kind of pay off. And I'm sorry these videos go so long, everybody. It's just, I like to make these videos like I'm having a conversation with my friends in the same room and just sharing my thoughts and ideas. Now, your mileage may vary. You may meet people that say I'm full of crap. That's fine. I don't care. But I want you to look at this for a minute. And number 1 is when you're on the downwind. Number 2 is when you're turning downwind to base. Number 3 is you're turning base to final. In a full-scale airplane, at number 1, we'll set our RPM, drop 1 notch of flaps, get the plane trimmed. Remember I said earlier the word trim? So I'm reaching down, I'm grabbing the trim wheel, or I've got the trim on my yoke. When I turn base to final, downwind to base, it might be when I pull an extra notch of flaps and I'm trimming the airplane. Then as I'm turning base to final and I'm lined up and I see I'm going to land, I'll pull full flaps and I'll trim the airplane. Keep in mind the whole time I'm missing a little bit with my power if I'm getting too low or I'm getting too high. Okay, keep in mind I'm using my pitch for my airspeed. In model airplanes, we have if you took a graph of your skills of flying a model airplane and said that takeoff's easy, cruise is easy, landing uses a lot of your skills. On a model airplane, we don't have a stall horn that would tell us we're getting too slow. We don't have an airspeed indicator telling us we're getting too slow. We have a visual. We see the airplane. So if I've got an airplane that has retracts and flaps, I've got the flaps, gear, power, and trim all figured out at the number 1. Because what I don't want to be doing is, as I'm turning the airplane, I'm pulling the nose up. If you remember my earlier videos where I talked about the teeter-totter effect, anytime I'm pulling back on my stick, I know I'm raising the angle of attack of the airplane. So I'm adding a little bit of power to hold that power. Anytime you raise the angle of attack, you lose your airspeed. So honest to God, I have muscle memory with my thumbs that if I'm pulling back on this one, I'm normally moving up my throttle, especially when I'm in my landing configuration. So I know I've heard people say, okay, gear down, and they're flying the pattern, flaps number 1, flap number 2. On my planes, I just have 3 settings of flaps, up, takeoff, and then landing. But keep in mind, 90% of RC airplanes don't need flaps. Actually, flaps make the planes fly harder because people don't trim it. Keep in mind, the last word there, excuse me, is trim. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the airframe design and trim and how a friend of mine could never land this one airplane right. And it took, believe it or not, we just created a rat's nest of problems before we finally figured out what was wrong with this airplane. But my suggestion to you, and your mileage may vary, I'm not saying you have to do this, is that get your plane completely configured before you end up messing with that base, downwind to base and base to final. And I'll show you why I mean that. 90% of the wrecks I've seen happening in the landing pattern happen turning from base to final. And this is where this kid I was talking to the other day had a crash. And he admittedly says he was messing around with the radio a little bit. Because, anytime we get a radio, it takes us a while to know where all the switches are without looking at the radio. And one reason this is such a dangerous part of landing is we're looking at our airplane like this normally. So think about this for a minute. Look at the number 3 and look at the airplane and tell me visually how you can tell how fast that airplane's going. It's really hard. Now, when it's flying in front of us, we can kind of get an idea how fast it is. When we're turning downwind to base, we kind of have an idea. But when we're turning base to final, a lot of times we start to overshoot the runway, so we start pulling up on the elevator more. Are we adding power? Some people aren't. They're just pulling that nose up. And then, because anytime your aileron's down, you've increased the angle of attack of that wing, which means that if you're not using a lot of rudder in this turn, you're setting yourself up for basically a snap roll, or a stall to snap, or a stall to spin in. And then you think about how far out you fly. So I love, and let me make this full screen for a minute, I love when I was messing around with my 3D software and made this. I've seen people fly planes so far out when they're landing that you can't even tell if the landing gear's down. They're asking me, can you see my gears down? I feel like saying, if you can't see your gears down, why are you landing? But this is really important, people, that you understand. You have to see your airplane. You have to know your airspeed. Okay, if you're going to land successfully, it has to be it's got to be a stable approach. The moment it's not a stable approach, go around unless your engine's died. So I'm going to try to wind this down pretty quick now. When we talk about design, I'm going to take you through something that happened 20-something years ago. And I learned so much on how the layout and design of your airplane can completely make a plane really hard to fly. But it was totally fixable. So this is my half-scale pits I built 10 or 15 years ago. And when it was done, it did not have my daughter sitting in it, okay? Actually, this is probably 18, 19 years ago because she's 20 now. So probably 18 years ago or 17 years ago. I don't know how old she is. I can't tell the age of kids by their sizes. But when the airplane was done, a friend of mine looked in the cockpit and said, what is your fuel tank doing all the way back here? And I said, well, I put the fuel tank on the CG. CG on this airplane was the bottom of the leading edge. The leading edge of the bottom wing was the CG. So I had my big old fuel tank sitting there. And I'll explain why. Because I learned something about 25 years ago, at least now, maybe 30. So a friend of mine built a big P-40. And I think it was from his early plans. He had blown up a little bit. And in a perfect world, we would put our fuel tank on the airplane right on the CG. But most of us don't do that. We put that fuel tank right against the firewall. So you got a firewall, engine. Sometimes you'll take the front of the fuel tank and stick it through the firewall so that you can get the hoses right there to the engine. And on this P-40 he had, every time he landed it, it started to porpoise. At least it looked like it was porpoising. And I said, holy crap, dude. I said, that thing's tail heavy. I was totally wrong. It wasn't tail heavy at all. But I actually started us down the wrong path, because when he says it's almost unflyable, Damon. And I'm like, we got to get that on a stand. We go back to his shop. We put the P-40 on the stand. The CG was perfect. And I'm like, what's wrong with this airplane? And I had already been scratch building, so it's got to be incidents. Let's check the incidences. We check all the incidences. They were spot on. I'm like, I want to fly your airplane. So we go back 2 weeks later because we both had jobs and lives and rain. I flew the airplane and I landed it perfect. He's like, what the hell? And look, this friend of mine was a better pilot than me. So I'm thinking, what is he doing to this airplane? So I said, dude, wait a minute. Show me how you're flying the airplane. The first thing I noticed is he was never touching his trim. And I said, what? Wait a minute. What do you mean you're not touching your trim? And I'm trying to figure out exactly how I figured out he wasn't. Oh no, I remember. He had fueled the airplane up and he pulled the trim way back. And I'm like, why do you do that? He goes, because it noses over if I don't have almost full up elevator. I said, well, how does it fly? And he goes, it flies perfect. And I said, wait a minute, with full up elevator trim, it flies level? He goes, yeah. I said, that sounds like a nose heavy airplane. But I thought back, wait a minute, we had it on the CG thing we built. I couldn't figure out what it was. So he takes it and flies it, and he turns final, and he starts to porpoise again, and I'm just like, let me fly it. So I grabbed it, and I moved that trim so far forward that I said, I don't know why your trim's changing so much. So we land, and we're sitting there, and he had a big 5-gallon gas of his his gas and oil mixture. I said, how big is your fuel tank on this? He goes, oh, I think it's 30 ounces. And I'm like, wait a minute, 30 ounces? I said, that's almost a liter. And he goes, yeah. I'm like, where's it at? And he goes, where I put all my fuel tanks. So here was the problem, folks. He was putting 30 ounces ahead of the CG of that airplane, so much that he needed full up trim, full up elevator to taxi it, or it would have fallen over on the prop. And he had broke a couple of men's props on this airplane. So I said, dude, wait a minute. You're taking off so nose heavy. And since you're not retrimming when you drop your gear and flap, you basically are trying to land an airplane that has full up trim. You're pushing the nose down and you're fighting it. And he goes, you think? I said, take all the fuel out. We took all the fuel out and we put in, I'm trying to remember how we measured it, but we put in something like 10 or 15 ounces of fuel. I took it up, trimmed it out. When I put the flaps down, the plane really did balloon a lot on us. And I had to do another 2 or 3 clicks of down elevator to keep it level. So once I had it all trimmed out, I hand him the radio, I say, land your airplane. He landed it perfect. He is like, oh my God, we're figuring this out. And I said, dude, you have 30 ounces way ahead of your CG on this airplane. We've got to get that fuel tank back closer to your wing if you want to fly with 30 ounces of gas. And it might have been more than 30. In my mind, I keep thinking it was 30 ounces. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't flown gas in 20 years, or in 17 years. But that was a real big problem with that airplane. Okay. So, boy, I went long on this video. I'm sorry, everybody. So now I want to talk about the passion real quick, and I'll try to fly through this. So the passion is where we save up all of our milk money or all of our paper route money, and we buy an airplane. And we know if we crash it, we're not going to be able to buy another one for at least a year because we don't have a lot of expendable money. Or you spend 5 years building an airplane, putting 10,000 rivets on it, and you're scared to death to fly it because you don't want to hurt it. That passion can be the death of your airplane. I have seen people freeze and wreck an airplane when the airplane was flying fine. I saw in the last 5 years probably 10 airframes crash because people either came in way too hot, smacked the ground, blew the gear off, stalled the airplane and just destroyed it, or they flew it into the ground because they didn't flare, or they just got it so slow turning base to final it fell out of the air. And afterwards they said, I was just too scared to land it. I had a friend one time take off an EDF flying it, and he yelled, somebody needs to help me land this. It's too hot for me. And I was standing right by him. I grabbed the radio. I slowed the plane way down. I said, dude, look how slow this will fly. And I landed it perfect. And I said, let's get you right back up and you slow fly this airplane. So you can't be so scared of your airplane that you freeze. You've got, even if it's going to crash, fly it right to the crash. Don't just freeze. Make sure you've got a spotter or a backup pilot that's really good if you think it's going to be too much for you to fly. Have somebody standing there to hand the radio to. Okay? When I think about my MSL-1, I was actually pretty nervous to fly it at first. But I would take up a beater plane, fly the hell out of it, and then jump in and fly this. and my adrenaline was already down from flying the beater airplane. You know, doing loops, rolls, snap rolls, taking off and rolling inverted, making sure my pilot juices were flowing. And then I flew this. But I'm going to tell you a trick. If you're a maker or somebody who's building from scratch, this might help you. So this was my MSL2. I called it the yellow banana. And the reason I called it the yellow banana the first year is I didn't do anything to it except fly it. It didn't even have a pilot, and people made fun of me. And the plane had PTSD from not having a pilot. All of my planes get sad if they don't have a pilot in them, because they're like, dag, I look really stupid. It's like I don't have any clothes on. But I flew the first year like this. The next year, I had painted it, still didn't finish the landing gear, had kind of a crappy looking radial engine and 3D printed radial engine at the time. The third year, I got the really cool 3D radial engine in it, and the new landing gear. I'm trying to figure out what else I did on the third year. And then this is the fourth year it's flying. It's got the 2-row radio. It's all decked out. It's got the lights in the exhaust that blink. It's just an all-around kick-ass airplane. It's actually my go-to fun plane to fly right now. But here's the thing is, I'm not scared at all to fly this airplane now. If I check the internal resistance on my batteries, if I check, make sure they're charged, my receiver batteries are charged, and it's not too windy, or it's not thunder and lightning and raining, there's no reason this airplane shouldn't fly beautiful. But I will tell you one thing about this airplane. I look like crap when I land this airplane. This airplane is so light. It's got the wing loading, Q-wing loading of a glider or a sport plane. It's so big when I fly it, it just looks like it's going to fall out of the sky, so I always land too hot. And one thing about landing an airplane too hot that has this kind of a landing gear, my airplane has the wheels almost the same place as the GB. The GB wheels are like almost at the leading edge of the wing. So, because of inertia, if you touch down too hot, the tail drops, you got a positive angle attack and the plane takes back off. And you start doing this and you get into your pilot-induced oscillation. My MSL2, right here, I look like I'm a really bad pilot when I fly this airplane. Well, when I land this airplane. When I fly it, everybody's like, oh, that looks so real. When I land it, everybody's like, what happened to your landing? Like I said, I suck at landing this airplane. And I've flown this plane 115 times now. Okay, now if there is no wind at all, I really bounce the crap out of this airplane because I'm afraid to do a complete full stall landing. And I want to end this video talking about full stall landings. And I'm not trying to put people down. If you watch my channel, and if you're still watching now, you must love hearing me talk. I ran into a couple of people that will argue with you that the only way to land an airplane is a full stall landing. And I don't say a word. I just let them say it. But here's why I personally feel like they are totally wrong. Jumbo jets don't land in full stall landings. You don't land an A36 Bonanza in a full stall landing. That's a full scale airplane. Most airplanes want to land as smooth as you can, which means they're still flying a little bit when they touch down on the ground. And then as you pull the power all the way to idle, or if you're already at idle, you just let it roll on the grass, it's slowing down, then it's landed. The problem with full stall landings is a lot of people aren't good rudder pilots. So if you start to dip a wing, you're wanting to use aileron, and it's natural. I do it all the time. If I'm in a full stall landing and my wing dips, I'm moving both rudder and aileron. So the rudder kind of saves my ass. But if you move aileron at all in a full stall landing, that wing will drop. And the last thing we want to do is be in a full stall situation where we hit the ground and your attitude goes up enough that the wing will still lift, even though it's stalled. Just because of the maybe ground effect, you get a foot into the air and now you're not flying at all. You're not stalled. I mean, that airplane ain't flying. And if you drop a wing, that's how you can cartwheel or you can destroy your landing gear. So my opinion is learn how to land an airplane where you grease it in. Making every landing a full stall landing could get you in trouble. And I know people say, oh, well, I fly full scale and all I do is full stall landings. If you're flying a Cub, good for you. If you're flying like a, oh gosh, I mean, I hated full stall landings in my Cherokees because I was afraid of dropping a wing. Okay. So thanks everybody for watching this video. This went longer way longer. I thought I could do this in 20 minutes, and we're up to almost 45 minutes. So look, everybody, I'm just trying to help people understand that if you're a disciplined pilot, teach yourself how to fly. Land by that paper plate. Get the skills that you can put your airplane anywhere you want it. Get your skills. Another really neat skill is put 2 balloons in the air, helium balloons, 20 feet apart. Try to fly between them. You'll be amazed how hard that really is if they're 20 feet apart. Now, I can't do it on some of my airplanes because my planes are like 16-foot wingspans. There wouldn't be much there. But if you've got like a 60-inch or 80-inch plane, set those 2 balloons 20 feet apart. See if you can go by them. If you want to get really gutsy, we used to do this back in the day. Every 100 feet, set a balloon and try to do slalom around them without hitting the balloon. Make sure you got a big enough plane that if you hit the balloon, it's not going to crash you. Okay? So rock on, everybody. And you know I always end my videos, take a kid flying. You need to love them even if they like FPV. You got to love them even though they fly quads, drones. I remember back in the day, everybody hated helicopters and gliders. So just love everybody who loves aviation. If you're one of those old farts that don't like the kids flying the FPV and drones or the park flyers or anything that's not what you fly, you need to go away. Just get away from model aviation. Don't taint it. Don't infect it. Just let the young people, and I'm talking kids that are 6 years old up to 16, let them embrace our hobby. Rock on, everybody. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Sorry for being so chatty. Peace.